I'm also involved with voter registration.
Yes.
I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what happened on 9/11 back in 2001. That day was a day that a lot of people likened to a heart. The United States was kind of a slumbering giant, just having fun, making money. Didn't have a lot of opposition to the Soviet Union, had fallen, and we were suddenly awoken from our slumber by a threat, and this time it was a different threat. So what I'm going to talk about is 9/11, and I was in the Pentagon when that happened, and I'm going to tell you from my eyes what happened there, but also because of my involvement, my career as an intelligence officer in the Air Force, at a different perspective. So we'll talk a little bit about terrorism as well. Okay, and we'll wrap up this one. Maybe the future of terrorism as far as we're concerned. How many of you have been to the Pentagon or been by the Pentagon and seen it? Okay, well, it's really a marvel of construction. I'll give you some data. It's actually the largest office building in the world. Modern fortress, covers 29 acres, houses 24,000 employees. There's over 17 miles of corridors. The building itself is 77 feet high. There's 5 outside walls, and each of those outside walls are over 3 football fields long, just to give you some perspective. And coincidentally, the groundbreaking ceremony for the Pentagon was on 9/11/1941, exactly 60 years before our 9/11. My history with Pentagon began the May 2001. The Air Force decided I didn't need to have fun on the island of Guam anymore in the Pacific, so they threw me into the Pentagon there in Washington, D.C. That was quite a culture shock, but I worked at the intelligence directorate for the Air Force there at the Pentagon. The evening prior to September 10th, I actually started watching a DVD that I recently purchased called Tora, or the attack on Pearl Harbor. That really never in my wildest dreams or nightmares, I guess, would I have realized that the following day our country would suffer the worst attack on its soil since the attack of Pearl Harbor. Now, the first question after it happened is, okay, who did this to us? Second and third questions are why, and then how. So, as we now know, the WHO was the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization led by Osama bin Laden. He was the son of a construction millionaire, not a destitute individual seeking terrorism as a way out. As far as the why, it was at that time and remains the stated goal of Al-Qaeda to establish a global caliphate throughout the world by working with other Islamic extremist groups to overthrow regimes that it considered non-Islamic and expel Westerners from Muslim countries. So in 1998, a fatwa was issued by Osama bin Laden and some other leaders of terrorist organizations, and it called for a jihad or holy war against the heretics, which is us. And it stated that it's the duty of all Muslims to kill U.S. citizens, civilian or military, and their allies everywhere. So Al-Qaeda issued the jihad, but even before that, these are some examples of some of the attacks that they've been involved in. They had either planned them, financed them, provided other support to related groups, or they had conducted them themselves. The bombing of the Khobar Towers was a truck bomb. But then in 2000, the attack on the Cole was like a truck bomb, but they used boats. So what we were seeing was they were developing tactics. After different attacks, they would assess our response, and then they would develop tactics to counter our response, our attempt to try to keep those things from happening. And as we know, less than a year after the attack on the Cole, we would see yet another change in their tactics. So on 9/11 that morning, I was attending a meeting on the 4th floor of the Pentagon, and about 9 o'clock, we took a break. I went back to my office down on the 3rd floor, and one of the majors that worked for me said, "Hey, Colonel, there's been an aircraft flew into one of the Twin Towers, and we suspect terrorism." I went back after the break to the training room I was in, and I kind of thought to myself as I was going, gee, I wonder what would happen if they were playing the Pentagon, right? This big, massive, it just went in one part of my head and out the other, because it's a very solid structure, and it's kind of a stupid thing to think about anyway. But then, not too long after that, there was an enormous, not too long after that, I'm skipping ahead of myself here, at around 9:40, that scenario actually played out in my mind. As American Airlines Flight 77 and its 54 crew members and passengers slammed into the west side of the Pentagon, the wedge adjacent to where I was at the time, killing an additional 125 military and civilian employees. Now, that was the HAL, a civilian airliner filled with jet fuel, commandeered by a group of terrorists willing to die for their God. And what I remember is a big, loud thud, and then everything shook. And I've been in earthquakes before. It was kind of like a short earthquake. Then next you hear screams coming from the hallway. You hear people shouting, "Evacuate, evacuate." And I had been involved in counterterror before, and I realized some of the tactics of terrorist organizations are to have an initial bombing, and then later, as emergency crews came in and people came in to relieve, then there'd be a secondary bombing that would kill even more people. So my thought first was, this is kind of stupid. We're all evacuating the building, because I thought, what if it was a bomb to the parking lot? So nonetheless, we were told to evacuate. So as I was exiting the building over to this area, there was a utility stairway that some of us used. I was by myself. And I remember once I stepped outside onto the stairs, I was stepping on some glass. And I thought, well, that's odd. And I looked up, and I saw the darkest smoke I've ever seen just billowing over the top of the Pentagon. And it was that moment I realized, this was not a car bomb. So I followed, basically it was kind of like a river of evacuees. I mentioned the 24,000 people. 395's over here, there's an embankment, and most of the people were lined up along the embankment, and there were thousands and thousands of people that I swear you could have heard a pin drop, because everybody was looking at this huge hole in the Pentagon. It was still burning, smoke was still rising, and it was like Washington, D.C. just kind of came to a grinding halt. The interstates were all closed. The metro closed down for several hours. For some of us, under the interstate, there's a couple tunnels people can use to go to the other side. There's hotels and Crystal City malls and stuff like that. So I waited for about 2 hours, crossed over with some of the other people's cell phones wouldn't work. They were all jammed. So if you can imagine something like this going on, you can't communicate with your family or anybody. But I crossed over and was able to get to a hotel where they had a payphone back in the day. And waiting in line for about 2 hours, I was finally able to get through to my family, my wife, and tell her I was okay. In the meantime, in the hotel, they'd set up some big screens, and you could watch the Twin Towers burning as well at the same time. My location at the time of the strike was right over here. Normally, I'm down on the 3rd floor. In intelligence, you usually work in vaults, so I was in a vault on the 3rd floor, but up here in the training. And the plane attacked, hit on the west side, and it pierced the first couple rings. The aircraft itself busted through the first couple rings of the Pentagon. And it's a series of concentric rings. But because the wings were filled with jet fuel, it created a flash fire that just came all the way to the Navy. And the fortunate part was, well, there's two fortunate parts. One, thank God the trajectory of the aircraft was kind of horizontal. If it had been at a higher angle and hit the courtyard, we used to call this ground zero before 9/11, because during the Cold War, this was a target for the Soviet Union and their ICBMs. So we kind of call it, realized that we would be like the first target to be hit if we ever went to war with the Soviet Union. But if it had hit ground zero, the blast would have killed a lot more people and done a lot more damage. As it was, this area here had just recently actually was still in the process of being refurbished. And so there were a lot of empty offices, and it was a little sturdier. There were better systems for fire control and things like that. So it could have been much worse. Immediately after, believe it or not, people had to go back to work, asbestos dust and all. But they closed off this area here, so about half of the Pentagon was closed off. In the meantime, the rest of us really kicked it into gear, went into overdrive, and the global war on terror began. So without missing a beat, the Pentagon, yes?
I wanted to ask before you got too far away. You said that everyone kind of had to get back to work, I assume, on basically figuring out who just crashed a plane into our building?
That didn't take very long to figure that out.
Piggyback off that question. It's a great question. So the event occurs. Your mind is going 1,000 miles an hour, but I'm sure at least you had the tactical, here's what's happening, here's what's going on. How soon, in your opinion, were you completely clueless as to what happened? You said it's probably a terrorist attack. Right off the bat, you thought that.
Right.
Do you have any idea that who we were dealing with at the time this terrorist attack occurred? Or was this out of left field for you?
Well, the office I was in at that moment was not dealing with the terrorist threat. So I didn't know. However, as I'm going to mention here in a little bit, I changed jobs when I went back. The next day, we started the Crisis Action Team, the AFCAT, Air Force Crisis Action Team, down in the basement of the Pentagon. And that's when we started. Basically, the military did a complete 180-degree turn. It's kind of like you're in a factory that makes refrigerators, and the next day you're expected to produce Ferraris, right? So we completely had to change who the suspected enemy was. The focus no longer on the potential of Soviet attack, and even then there wasn't really that fear, but we were still focused on a conventional threat and not on the unconventional threat that Al-Qaeda presented. But at any rate, it wasn't too long before we knew exactly. And that's not just us at the Pentagon, but there had been issues with Al-Qaeda in the past, as I was showing you, a lot of issues.
I had read Richard Clarke's book, and in Richard Clarke's book, the second he saw the reporting about the Twin Towers, he was walking through the halls of the White House saying, this is the attack we knew was going to come. These are the people we knew were going to be responsible. Like, he was already on the ball, but that's his office, obviously, less so your office at the time. Right. Just, did you get a feeling that the Pentagon at large, the people that worked there alongside you were completely clueless at the time? Or was anybody even thinking that?
No.
Or they just thinking,
No, not really.
get out?
Were you really thinking?
Okay.
But that shows the resilience and the flexibility of the U.S. military. Because as we saw, it wasn't long later at all that the global war on terrorism started. We were able to do that completely refocus. And so that should be a comfort to everybody here anyway, that we were able to do that. Yes?
Yeah, that was when this happened though, that the government put a full attack out on Islam, but it wasn't just Islam, it was the Sunni.
They did not put a full attack out.
Because they were trying to find the separatist faction inside the groups.
Well,
because I know the Nation of Islam said they weren't a part of it. The Sufis said they weren't a part of it.
yeah.
And it was, the one who took hand was Al Qaeda, and they're Sunni, but they're not even Islam though. They're part of the philosophy.
We're not quite there yet. Go ahead.
There actually wasn't a full-scale war against Islam. In fact, a lot of Islamic Americans came forward
Denouncing
and
the attack,
assisted.
yeah.
And assisted. My office, for example, one of the things we did was we had to identify individuals that spoke Farsi and many different languages, Punjabi and Arabic, and so yeah, there were a lot of Islamic Americans that came forward to volunteer their services
Yeah.
to help, in that initial sense of that war. So, but anyway, shortly after we started our attacks in Afghanistan, because the Taliban government, we said, okay, we know you have Osama bin Laden. And they refused, of course, because they're allies, and that's when we started the attacks. And Operation Enduring Freedom began. I'm not sure. Okay, concurrent with Operation Enduring Freedom was protection of the homeland, but we also had operations against terrorism as far away as the Philippines in conjunction with the war on terror. And that December, following December, I transferred, actually December of 2002. I worked in the AFCAT for the rest of 2001 through about mid-2002. And then in December of 2002, I transferred to CIA headquarters, where I was the executive officer for the associate director of Central Intelligence for Military Support. So our office was kind of a conduit between the CIA and the Department of Defense, and we worked counter-proliferation issues and counterterrorism issues. But while most of our, I can't really speak to most of our counter-terror at the time, what I can say is, of course, tremendous headway was made in reducing terrorism as a threat to our national security since 9/11. In fact, since 9/11, there have been over 100 terrorist plots for attacks here in the United States that have been uncovered, attacks that never happened. And this is where I'm going to start to talk a little bit about the current situation, because things have changed rapidly. As a result of America's initial success in the war on terror, both in the U.S. and overseas, has been a significant restructuring of the terrorist network that has taken place. And with bin Laden's death, it was seen as a positive psychological victory for the forces of counterterror. But at the same time, now as a martyr, bin Laden and his death has inspired new generations of jihadi terrorists. In my opinion, terrorism is kind of like a virus. So when it feels threatened or when it's attacked, it morphs and changes to survive. That's kind of what happens with Al-Qaeda. So although Al-Qaeda's original leadership was eliminated, it continued to provide inspiration and organization to organizations like the Islamic State, or ISIS, that we hear about. In fact, ISIS was formerly Iraq, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda is now led by al-Zawahiri, who was actually the religious advisor to bin Laden. But and when bin Laden's death, Zawahiri was elevated. Al-Qaeda disagreed with ISIS because they were very brutal, and Al-Qaeda wanted the support from more moderate Muslims in order to proceed with their mission. And actually, the two groups fought each other in Iraq and Syria. A lot of people don't realize that. But with the end of ISIS, or the recent demise of ISIS, a revived Al-Qaeda is now seen as probably our main threat in the world as far as terrorism. And a lot of people don't realize this, but Al-Qaeda currently has upwards of 20,000 armed troops in Syria. Has taken that. Another area of concern, they're very active in Yemen and Somalia, but another area of concern where Al-Qaeda is currently, their increasing presence in the Kashmir area between Pakistan and India. Now, As you know, this is one of the hottest potential flashpoints for nuclear war in the world. One of the things that the United States really is concerned about is the Pakistani leadership becoming radicalized, and that's exactly what Al-Qaeda wants. Al-Qaeda also would love to provoke India into attacking Pakistan or some provocative action. So that's a big concern, and hopefully they won't have too many more there. But this is just an example of the impact Al-Qaeda continues to have on the world. And how are we doing in the war on terror? Well, actually, to date, let's say in 2016, this is from 2016, about the number of deaths from terrorism are about 3 times as many as in 9/11, 2001. It seems like a lot, and it is, but one of the reasons is we've been very successful in fighting terrorism. So now terrorist affiliates of Al-Qaeda, which included ISIS, are changing their tactics, and they're using opportunities to join insurgencies in some of these countries that are trying to overthrow non-Islam friendly Islamic countries, in other words. The Arab Spring, if you remember that, the Arab Spring really did a lot for Al-Qaeda. They got their foot in the door in a lot of these locations where there are insurgencies. And so a lot of the deaths that are being attributed to terrorism are taking place in those hotspots.
Let me ask that, because for those of you not familiar with Arab Spring was a movement across the Middle East, 2012, 2013, what window of time was it occurring?
13, yeah.
Okay, so it was over a couple of years where a bunch of these Middle Eastern countries, none of which are democratic, started facing a lot of democratic pressure, a lot of uprisings.
Egypt, Libya, Gaddafi in Libya was removed.
Right, so those governments fucked their own people to suppress their democratic rallies. Why would that be an in your opinion, for like Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups?
Because a lot of those locations, like Muammar Gaddafi, he didn't want to have anything to do with Al-Qaeda, frankly, because he knew that he would lose power as they gained power, and there was already a large element of radical Islamic extremism in Libya, same with Algeria. So those were seen as countries that were not friendly to radical Islam, even though Gaddafi was kind of crazy in and of himself, and he was all about himself. So they did not fall into the brand of Islam, radical Sunni Wahhabism that Al-Qaeda did. So, but Syria also, you see what's happened in Syria, and a country that is really non-Islamic, but is populated by Shia and Sunni Muslims. One bright spot, though, that we see is that since 2013, the numbers of deaths worldwide have been reduced. And we're seeing a trend, a reduction. And for example, in 2016, there was a 23% drop in the number of deaths. In 2017, there was a 27% drop. So it's going down. It's still around a little over 18,000 deaths per year based on because of terrorism. That is attributed largely to the fact that the counter-terror operations are being increasingly successful, and
Can I ask you about that?
yes,
So we haven't had another 9/11
Right.
since 9/11.
right.
You have to put your finger on a reason why.
Because I firmly believe that, for one thing, we took control of a lot of the financial capability of radical Islam. And Al-Qaeda is now living basically vicariously through their affiliate organizations in these different countries. So, and those affiliates are more interested in securing their base before we're not worried about them trying to attack the United States. Some examples, a lot of these attacks are taking place from grassroots terrorists. Here in the United States, we see a lot of American citizens that are influenced by Islam, by ISIS propaganda. They're radicalized, and they're the ones that are doing a lot of the damage. We're not seeing a lot of those operators from other countries that are trained, like we saw with Al-Qaeda originally with the 9/11 attack. So my next slide will talk a little bit more, but originally the idea for the global jihad was first to overcome the countries, the Arabic countries, the Muslim countries, and radicalize them. And then, that's after they've established their regional caliphate, then push for the global caliphate against the West. Well, Al-Qaeda kind of jumped the gun on that and attacked the United States, kind of pissed us off, and we took direct action. And so now they're backing away from all that and concentrating more on the regional activity. So eventually, either through desperation, or they may be emboldened by success, or they may feel like they're backed into a corner. And at that point, we can expect more in the West. And this brings us to my last slide, which basically the question is, so what's the future of terrorism? Well, at some point, it's possible that terrorists could have access to nuclear weapons. Normally, that's not going to happen except maybe through a state. That's why we were worried about Pakistan. That's why we were worried about Iran, who is the largest state supporter of terrorism in the world. That's why we're worried about North Korea. Some of these countries that are anti-US, anti-West. But what we could see at one extreme is use of nuclear weapons for EMP. I don't know if any of you are familiar with electromagnetic pulse. But basically, that would involve maybe 2 or 3 high atmospheric explosions, nuclear explosions, that would basically melt down our electronic infrastructure here in the United States. Theoretically, could destroy the electronic power grid and infrastructure. If you haven't, if you're interested in that kind of thing, there was a study, a congressionally supported study, and I can get that information to you later. Also, there's the book, 1 Second After. I don't know if anybody's, if you haven't read that book, you want to maybe not be able to sleep at night for a couple weeks, that's a good book to read. But it's about an EMP strike in the United States. Probably more likely, you might be able to see biological or chemical attacks, but probably more likely is going to be a radiological, what we call a dirty bomb. And a dirty bomb attack is basically, you get radioactive material, like from the dentist or the hospital or whatever, radioactive material, and you basically blow it up. You can use a conventional weapon, and then you have radioactive fallout in a relatively large area.
It's basically radioactive shrapnel.
Right, yeah. So the radioactive contamination may, in like Washington, D.C. or New York City, or one of our port facilities, if it's at a port facility, let's say a ship comes in, a container comes in, and it's not caught, and there's a dirty bomb that goes off, that could shut down all the ports in the United States. The government will shut it down while they're trying to find and see if there's others. And that could cause up to $58 billion in damage. There was a study done, an estimate, causing a lot of damage to our economy. We could be without a lot of our favorite foods like bananas and maybe computer chips and things like that for a long time. But those are some different examples of tactics that could be used.
Okay, so I invite at this moment, if it's okay with you, Dr. Lundstrum, anybody who has a question about anything he said, including his experience, please raise your hand. If I could just start us off, though. You and I have very different experiences on 9/11. When a 9/11 occurred, I was asleep in my dorm room and I slept through it. So your experience and my experience is completely different. Doing what you've done, living what you've lived through, knowing what you know, talk to somebody like me who's out of the soup you swim in. When I say, I'm not scared of terrorism, there are statistics that you're more likely to be murdered by your own couch than you are by Islamic terrorism. And part of that is due to the phenomenal work that folks like yourself have done. What would you say to somebody who responds to terrorism that way? And that's in polling too. People are worried about the economy and immigration, blah, 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 blah. Terrorism.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to myself specifically, but also society that cares, not cares less, but just worries less about terrorism?
Well, I would say that, I talked about the over 100 terrorist attacks that have been thwarted. I would say that ignorance is bliss. And quite frankly, one of the reasons, when I retired from the military, I was offered a job to stay on with the CIA. But I have a family, and Washington, D.C. at the time had a big target drawn on it. And knowing what I knew, I just didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel comfortable living with my suitcases packed, my bug-out bag in my vehicle, and having made arrangements with my family on where we would be, under what conditions. There's just a lot out there that the general public are not aware of, thankfully. And if they were, I don't know, I don't think our country, I don't think we would be enjoying a lot of the economic success we are. People would be overly stressed, and there's just a lot of nasty stuff out there. So I would say, keep enjoying life, but be aware that there are some really nasty people out there that would just love to have this country wiped off the face of the earth, quite frankly.
In your opinion, how would you judge, 18 years of hindsight, how would you judge America's response to 9/11?
Americans tend, if I'm talking to a bunch of political scientists in here, will agree, Americans have a very short memory span. But when called to action, we're unlike any people on earth. Ingenuity, bravery, courage, we just have it. We have what it takes to be. But a lot of times we have to get to a point that we can't believe that anybody would dare do something against us or oppose us or interrupt our comfortable way of life. And that's just not the way of the world.
Why did 9/11?
And if you travel, I encourage everybody to do world travel, live in other countries.
You got a country to recommend?
Yeah, Bangladesh was a lot.
Bangladesh.
Yeah. Indonesia. Now there's Singapore's actually my favorite place on earth. Seriously, I was kidding about Bangladesh.
So I assume you've read the 9/11 Commission report that came out. Okay, so we know why 9/11 happened, because of bad guys, but that involves us also dropping the ball. Because of the United States action or inaction, why did 9/11 happen?
We were focused on the wrong thing. There were a lot of people that were, I think, too comfortable and had some political skin at risk that didn't want to take chances. There's always, well, what if we do that and nothing happens? I don't know. Better safe than sorry isn't always what we hear from Washington, D.C. I'm very apolitical. Yes.
I personally do believe that 9/11 did happen. Bush didn't do it. I served the military. I know the capabilities were at. Sorry. But what's normally your response to those who say Bush did 9/11, the 9/11 was fake, it was staged?
I didn't see the airplane itself, but I know people personally that saw the airplane crashes.
That's a pretty good way of debunking that. I do want to ask, sorry, she's got a question. I'll let her.
I'm sorry. Okay, so my question is like, does anyone, and people might know this, but like, how exactly were the planes like hijacked between like security and like all of a sudden at the airport? Does anyone know that?
How are they hijacked?
Yeah.
Well, back then you could board an airplane with things like box cutters, and so I don't know what their tactics were. I haven't seen the movie. It kind of disturbs me to see some of those movies, so I haven't watched any 9/11 movies. But I'm sure they're probably very accurate. You might want to. Yes.
A while ago, you likened religious terrorism to being similar to a virus.
Well, terrorism period.
If I might extend the metaphor a little bit, the way one usually stops a virus is through prevention rather than active targeting, as it were.
Yeah, that's a good point.
At risk of getting into some morally gray areas, what would one do to, I guess, inoculate against terrorism?
You're exactly right, because part of the effort when I was in the Department of Defense, part of our effort was to educate citizens of those areas that are likely to be affected by that brand of radical Islamic terrorism. Education, support them with health. I mean, when we went to Afghanistan, we built schools, we built, water, we drilled wells, we increased their standard of living. And that was the best, that was the best way to inoculate against
To just make terrorism
Yeah.
not appealing to begin with?
Yes, yeah.
Now, you and I are very different people. You're emotionally intelligent. I am impulsive and childish. But with that in mind, does it not make your blood boil to see how comfy the United States is with Saudi Arabia, considering the experience that you went through and how Saudi Arabia was at least instrumental in carrying out that attack? Like I said, you probably manage your emotions better than I would. But if I went through what you went through, that'd make my blood boil.
It's like you have to balance, a lot of times you have to balance the evils, or probably a better way of putting that. You have to hedge your bets. So, and I know, there's, the problem is we have to trust other people that are doing the betting.
Were you familiar in 2016 when Congress passed JASTA, that JASTA bill that allows American 9/11 victim family members to sue Saudi Arabia? I don't know how legal that is internationally. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are, if Saudi Arabia wants to remain a benefactor of military arms sales and other things, then why not? And if they don't, then the families have recourse.
Have they so far?
I don't know if I can answer that. That's an interesting question. They had the money, yes.
So I saw on it was like a map of general areas of occupation from Al-Qaeda. You had like several thousand in Somalia and Yemen, and I believe, I think it was Pakistan as well.
And they're not just Al-Qaeda, but they're Al-Qaeda affiliates.
Oh, okay. So that kind of almost answers my question, but how well connected are they to each other?
Well, actually, one of the studies I recently read talks about, actually it's not on that map, but there was a recent attack in the Philippines, and there was also an attack in, I want to say Indonesia, but I don't think it was Indonesia. But at any rate, no, let me back up. It wasn't. It was. I'm sorry. It was Nigeria. One of the affiliates in Nigeria, and I think one of the affiliates in Somalia, and you could tell they had coordinated attacks, and intelligence could tell they had coordinated attacks, and so that's why they believe, I mean, these are two disparate groups that are coordinating their Al-Qaeda, so that tells them that there is a Al-Qaeda queen bee somewhere that's telling the drones what to do, or at least giving them support in EMP would be the easiest way to take the United States out.
Do we have any like way of defense against it?
Well, good thing is we have deployed troops, we have submarines, we have aircraft carrier groups, they're disparate, so we have means of retaliating.
So even if the mainland does get hit, we still have to go back.
I mean, we can
Well,
shoot back, but it doesn't
yeah.
sound like we can recover from it very well.
The military has a lot of hardened capabilities that they don't, that would not necessarily be susceptible to EMP because we've known about EMP for decades. And we've seen potential testing with the Soviet Union, back as far as the Soviet Union and China. So the people that would be in the biggest danger would be those of us who are far away from some of the protected areas.
Dr. Lundstrum, how have you changed after 9/11? How has it changed either you as a person or at least your outlook on life?
Well, I've changed quite a bit since all that. I would say my life is focused quite differently than it used to be. It's more focused on other people and externals than internal and career-minded. There's kind of a rush to that type of work, and it's great for young people. There's some other things, yes.
I don't know if you like know this answer, but they want to be able to actually set up EMP with radius without testing first. And if they were to test it in anywhere they were at, and EMP themselves.
Well, EMP capability has been tested, so a lot of that would have to be theoretical. You know what a certain megatonnage would do, and so it's a matter of.
So it's more of a calculation.
It's more of a calculation. Probably what would happen would be probably a ship off the coasts.
Okay, round of applause for Dr. Lundstrum. We obviously have a meeting every month.